Matt, 1 to 100.
3.
Ooh.
Don't.
Are you a single issue voter? What is the most important position you look for in a candidate?
I used to rail against people who were single issue voters, and it turns out that I was just mad at the issue that was their most important. I don't think I would necessarily be a single issue voter, but there's some that are such a high priority. Like literally in the 2016 election, my wife and I were largely in agreement. She would only post one real comment about the election, and that was repeatedly saying, it's about the goddamn motherfucking Supreme Court. That's all she would post. And for her, she views that as a single issue thing. And of course, based on who you elect, because, okay, a president's going to go after at most 8 years now, but who you put on the Supreme Court is going to affect the world we live in for decades, if not generations. And that is probably also my highest priority issue. But there are some that are very close, and then there's others that are trivial. And I'm an idiot when it comes to money and finances and deficit and tax stuff. I think I could find people in all parties that make sense there, which is, I think economy is voodoo. At least from my perspective, yeah. Economics is just weird voodoo economics.
Am I allowed to answer that same question?
No. Oh, I'm kidding, yes.
In the 2016 election, I mean, I was looking at a clown car full of incompetence on the GOP side, and then I was looking at basically corporatists, and I'm not sure what the alternate category was, but there were some people that seemed to be beholden to corporations and big profits and everything, and other people who are more aligned toward socialism. And I still say I don't identify with socialism, but I understand that we should have a balance between capitalism and socialism, because runaway capitalism is every bit as bad and probably worse than runaway socialism. And my issue was always about the environment and everything, and so that I didn't understand why when George H.W. Bush was running, why the environment was not a key issue then, way back then. But in 2016, my favorite candidate was Bernie, and there were a handful of things that Bernie said that I wanted to have a couple of minutes to talk to Bernie about, to correct him, because there's no perfect candidate.
Yeah.
And I didn't, and a lot of people were accusing, if you vote for Bernie, then you're a Bernie bro and you worship Bernie. And no, Bernie's wrong about a handful of things, and I would love to have a moment to point out what he's wrong about.
Yeah, and in that one, I voted for Bernie in the primary. I voted for Hillary in the general. I pissed off a bunch of Bernie bros the other day because when he announced that he was running in 2020, I corrected his poster. Mostly because I thought it was an absolutely terrible slogan. Because if you're running for something, the first 2 words in your slogan shouldn't be "not me." But I didn't want him to run in 2020, and I didn't want Hillary to run in 2020. Not because I don't like either one of them or anything else. It's not because they had their time. It's because I don't want anything that reminds us of 2016. I want us to show that we've actually got progress, that we've got candidates, that we're not going to rehash what happened 4 years ago and end up with another 4 years of Trump.
What we had 4 years ago was awful.
Yeah.
That was so bad. Now, one of the candidates that I really like is Ocasio-Cortez. I really do. And
Wait, is she in the running for president?
No.
Okay.
No.
You said candidates, and I was like, no friggin' way.
Yeah, but understand, I don't look at the president as being a person of power to administrate over everything else to the degree that other people think that they are. We need, obviously, a body in the House. We need a body in the Senate. We need people who make wise decisions and vote intelligently. And here in Texas, especially, we don't have that. So I like that. I like that she comes up with this idea that Fox News says is absolutely impossible, and that every other presidential candidate says, you know what, that's a good idea. It is completely pushing the Overton window, but you know what? We're talking about the continuation of our species, and not just ours, a lot of others as well. So some consideration must be made for the larger spectrum. And our current leadership, obviously, is not in tune with that.
And that's the answer to, am I a single issue voter?
Okay. Last one, Aron, 1 to 100.
Hot button.
The next hot button? Wow, you're a glutton for punishment. All right, here we go.
Give me your worst one.
The worst one?
This is the last one, so give me the worst one.
Liking? The highlighted ones. 8? That's not hot button enough. He wants really hot button. Can we get Courtney? Give me a really hot button.
By the way, I love you.
Love you too. Even if we're getting ready to massively disagree on a hot button issue, which would be fun.
What do you think?
No.
I can't remember a time that you and I have
Okay.
massively disagreed
Courtney picked
on
this
an
one for
issue.
you.
We've had disagreements,
Don't get
but
mad at
it's
me
never
for
been
this.
an issue. It's one of the reasons why we're still friends, because people
Courtney
who
picked this one
can't
for
do
you.
this say,
Okay.
So blame her.
I think
Alright.
I'll agree with you guys on this, and Jim will disagree with you.
Yep,
But
I think you're correct about that.
Is-
And TJ will disagree too.
All right.
Is racism and or sexism systemic and institutional?
Yes.
yeah.
Name the institution or the system that makes it so.
Current American society,
Is it
not just
codified-
American
is it
society.
codified in written legal language?
Yes.
Is it expressly codified? No.
Yes, but
Go.
subtly. Yes, but it's subtly. And so you have to look at precedent. So both racism and sexism are systemic. We know, for example, that the reason that marijuana was criminalized was not anything against marijuana in particular. It was because that meant that we could jail more blacks and Hispanics.
When you phrase it that way, it essentially makes an implicit claim that the motivation was to jail more blacks and Hispanics, and I don't think that was the motivation. I think it was a side effect that not enough people gave a shit about.
I actually think that was the primary catalyst, and we're welcome to disagree on this.
And we do.
Okay.
I don't know how you could possibly demonstrate that the motivations of people who were instituting laws weren't just bad ideas that didn't care enough about the impact on minorities and were instead intentional goals of let's incarcerate minorities.
And I grant that this is largely because of videos that I've seen from people who stated that the reason that they advocated for these positions was because it predominantly isolated Hispanics and blacks.
That's the thing is, though, that to me would still be a minority position that isn't the reason why people vote for or support those things. When we talked about anti-abortion legislation, for years I fought with my wife and others because they would say, oh, the religious right just want to control sex, they want to punish women for their biology. And as somebody who, was...
And I agree with that.
Okay. I don't know how you can possibly demonstrate that, but I also know it's absolutely false because I used to be one of those people, and never was my motivation to punish women for their biology or to control sex. My motivation was to protect the life of the fetus. And what happened in addition to that was that's just tough luck. That's just the way it is. You live in this world, and yes, if it disproportionately affects women, then that's just the way it's got to be. But to say my motivation was to punish women for their biology is just flat wrong. And so when you make claims about what people's motivations are, you run the risk of them saying, well, gosh, my motivations have never been like that. And then they get to disregard everything you said. So instead of talking about what somebody's motivations are, I pretend to read minds on stage, but I can't do it for real. Instead, I can say the religious right wants to impose legislation that has the effect of controlling sex, punishing women for their biology, and they don't care enough about that effect because for whatever reason, maybe that's their motivation, maybe they have a different one, but they don't care about this real effect. And if you talk about the actual effects, you don't ever run the problem of falsely accusing someone of having a negative motivation. And that's why I'm fine with saying that there's systemic racism, there's systemic sexism. Some of it used to be codified, some of it is now changed. It is institutionalized in the sense that it is ingrained in the culture. But I don't ever have to say that it was somebody's motivation to throw as many African Americans in jail as possible. I can just say that they instituted laws that demonstrate they clearly didn't give a shit about whether or not they were incarcerating more African Americans than whites. And the problem has now been addressed without trying to pretend like I can read somebody's mind. And that's why I don't go to motivations.
Well, as I said, the reason that I come to this conclusion is because people have made videos expressing that back in the day this was the reason that they advocated this position.
What percentage of voters is that?
I'm not even talking about the percentage of voters. I'm talking about the legislators that had backed these positions, was because the primary goal of I wish I could come up with names, because now I can't justify my case completely if I don't have all the names for it.
Well, it's not even that. It's until, like, if somebody, let's say somebody with really bad motivations created a law. That law still has to be endorsed and passed by a number of other people. And until you get to the point where you can make a case that the majority of people advocating for something had the same motivations, I think it's a mistake to say that that was the motivation for it.
Bearing on this, I mean, in the state of California, there was a vote by 200 legislators that they passed a law. 200 legislators passed a law that it was illegal to hire a Chinaman. How the fuck do you get 200 legislators who don't realize how unconstitutional that is? Right? I mean, that's the first problem. And a lot of the other contentions that I'm having is because I had to interview Hector Garcia. I had to read 2 of his books, Alpha God and Sex, Power, and Politics.
Yep.
Both of which illustrate rather eloquently. Either book, preferably Alpha God, I think was the more moving of the 2 for me, for some of the subtleties that we overlook or that we're not even aware of.
One of the things is that there's some new studies that have come out that have, and I was reading one of them the other day, but I don't have a reference to cite. You can probably Google search it. That shows that the in-group, out-group thing, which is currently, well, it's pervasive, but quite often it's divided along racial lines or gender lines and other things, but it's still just an in-group, out-group thing. And what the study found is that once you change who is considered to be part of your in-group, like if you spend your time hanging out with more Mexicans, that fundamentally changes how likely they are to be considered your in-group. And so they contrive to have these mixed groups. And the former in-out lines begin to blur and vanish, and new in-out lines perform. So you can have this group where you've got like 5 Caucasians, 5 African Americans, and 5 Hispanic people, and where there might have been those lines within that group. Once this becomes the group that they're familiar with, this other group that is made up of equal proportions now becomes the out group for some other reason, either a political thing, and it's not even a real thing. They asked one group, what do you think the politics of people in your group are? And they tended to assume that the people in their new group agreed more with them than the people who were not in their new group. This in-group, out-group mindset is something that is a lizard brain tribal clinging on thing that we have. And once, I think if you begin to educate people about that, we'll break down some of those lines. I just have a difficult time, even when I've said and done things in the past that were sexist or racist or anything else, it was more about prioritizing the joke, prioritizing my in-group, prioritizing how I felt about things, than it was about hating or wanting to oppress another group. It was viewed not as let me keep blacks as poor as possible. It was, I don't know that group or care about that group enough to make this change an issue. And so when we start applying, nefarious or evil motivations to something that may just be negligence, ignorance, incompetence, or apathy, all of those are viable. And when you look at the voting block of people who would end up voting for legislation that has these effects, sorry, there's no way to say this, it's not condescending, and I include myself among the idiots. Most people have, like most theists don't know what's in their Bible. Most people don't know what they're voting on when they go to the polls. I'm going to pick everything with an R, everything with a D. I'm going to, yes, let's decrease taxes, even when an increase of tax might be the smartest thing to do. It's nope. I'm going to vote based on I don't want to pay more taxes.
Well, yeah, I got to interrupt, and I don't.
Yeah, no, I was done.
No, thank you. I did vote, just like run down the D's the last time I voted, but the reason that I did was because in 20 years of anti-theist activism, I have seen that the GOP is habitually responsible for the worst possible legislation. If it's racist, if it's designed only to deprive a particular group of their rights, of course it was a Republican who wrote it. It's never an option, right? So I did run,
or Joe Lieberman.
So I did actually run, with maybe an exception or two for particular candidates that I was aware of. I did run down the D's because in the last 20 years of my activism and advocacy, I've seen the most horrible things that are promoted by Republicans to where I have this waxed mustache, but I mean they actually twirl it.
Snidely whiplash.
Exactly. That's the impression I get. And by the way, I want to say, since we're both on camera, that I was interviewed by somebody advocating who claimed to be a former atheist who became a Catholic. And I said, even if you were born Catholic and raised Catholic, how the fuck could you still be Catholic now, much less be an atheist to begin with and become a Catholic now? I mean, how the fuck do you justify that position? But he got the impression, I don't know how he got this impression, but that I was insulting his intelligence. Yeah. And so he asked me to name somebody that I thought was more intelligent than myself. And I said, I have friends that I think are more intelligent than myself. And the name that he forced me to drop, of course, was yours.
Oh, well, thanks, but you're probably wrong. And as long as you think I'm smarter, you just have to take my word for it that you're wrong, and now you're smart.
Thank you. You two are off the hook unless one of you want to...
Yes.
Yes?
Well,
I'm off the hook, he's off the chain.
I think I know what you're saying.
Say it loud because the mic's on them.
I just have to ask you, based on the question that you said, that you're assuming that people have the bad agenda behind it because you used to be a Christian. Is it actually that you don't want to think that maybe based on Christianity that you had where women were set aside?
No, because I didn't agree with that. But go ahead. Sorry.
It's okay. I'm not a debater. So.
No. Sorry.
Well, he can give great hand jobs over here.
Oh, snap.
He said master debater. Okay, anyways. So.
Why am I sitting with you?
We're keeping the standards really high right now. All right, go ahead.
So,
I had a dream where I was a cross-country skier.
My question is it because you don't want to maybe acknowledge that, like, people don't like to accept that they're bad. Like, when somebody gets called a racist, they get defensive because they don't want to be called that. Mm-hmm. Is it that maybe you don't want to say that what he says could be right because you'd be afraid that you'd have to admit that that's the same pile that you were taught to be in? No.
And the reason I can say that is, number one, the reason I don't think that he's right is because I don't see the evidence for that. Okay.
Which thing are we talking about right now?
The motivations.
Okay.
The other aspect of it is I'm pretty good about acknowledging the fact that I have said and done racist, sexist things in the past.
Sure.
I also have a pretty good understanding of what I believed when I was still a believer.
Sure.
And I did not have a view of like women as secondary, and certainly not views with regard to race in that sense. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that I was immune to this, but I know that when your preacher is getting up there talking about how we need to oppose abortion access because God is the one in control of life, God grants life to a fetus, and it is our duty to protect that innocent life, the fact that there may be other motivations, they all become secondary at that point.
about how women should be behind the man and not speak and all those other things.
Yeah.
Where you're taught, even, you know, like commercials and stuff teach us through to be kind of racist. You know, there is, you know, colors and stuff.
Yep.
Even if it's not hardcore, it's back there, it settles, it's, you know, it gets in your psyche to where you unconsciously, like you move a Ouija board, like,
there's
and
a
that's
difference.
where I'm trying to get, like, where Christians are kind of raised, it may not be set out.
I'd like to interject for just a moment. I mean, I don't want to think that I was ever racist.
You are.
Yeah, I don't want to think that.
Yeah.
Okay. But I have to admit that although I never thought so until recently, you know, reevaluation of my prior positions and the way that I used to think, I had to realize that yes, there was a time when I was sexist.
Right.
And being aware of that, I think, is the best road to recovery, I guess.
The easy thing for me is that there's a difference between implicit and explicit racism, sexism, whatever ism. And so you have things like the KKK that are explicitly racist.
Although they deny that.
This is their stated motivation, we don't like people who aren't the same color as us. But that's explicit, and that's where you get into the motivational stuff where they're doing this. Then there's implicit racism, which I think is going to affect everybody to some extent, which is you're more comfortable with your in-group, and you've been raised around white people and you're raised in a culture where men are dominant, then you end up getting these tendencies that are certainly racist and sexist. That doesn't mean they're your primary motivations. And the thing that I'm trying to point out is that if my primary motivation is something that doesn't touch on sexism or racism, and I prioritize that over good ideas about equality, then it would be wrong to say that my primary motivation is because of racism and sexism. Instead, it would be more correct to say that my primary motivation causes implicit racism and sexism, or has implicit racism and sexism as an ancillary thing. Could I be wrong about my own motivations? Sure. But I've spent a good deal of time going through and doing the sort of inventory that I don't know that everybody does. But I also know that I didn't have those views about women, in part because while my dad was definitely the head of the household, and my wife and his wife, my mom, would say all day long, you know, your father is the head of the house just as Christ is the head of the church. They would say that. My mom was the head motherfucker in charge most of the time. And that duplicity completely annihilated that notion about women. Plus, the one thing that they did was that, you know, this whole, you know, women are special and you need to, like, don't talk harshly to women and don't, you know, hit women and all this other stuff, which I changed to let's not hit anybody.
Right.
Well, I have to agree with you there. I mean, I would not, I've been ingrained that I would never hit a woman, just period. I've never met a woman who could take me out in a fight, and so why would I ever need to haul up and in full force punch a woman? So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. Well,
We'll bring Rando Calrissian on the show next time.
yeah.
No, because
Should get the woman that beat Ronda's ass.
the problem
Home, yeah.
the problem with it,
Cyborg.
the problem with that is it kind of opens up a kink with me.
Oh boy. My kink is not your kink, but your kink's okay.
I used to watch what was it, the American Gladiators?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my porn back.